Hey everybody, this is Tommy and Kimberly from Ravens Creek, and today we want to bring you a little bit of Ravens food.
Today we want to begin to talk to you a little bit about the myths that happen between God and women, Christianity and church.
March happens to be Women's History Month, and so we thought what better way of celebrating than to go through some of the subject matter of Christianity, the Bible, and women. And a lot of the ways that it's taught, or at least even conceived of in Christianity nowadays, and even outside of Christianity, is that when you're talking about the Bible and women, you almost get this question that emerges of, does God hate women? Is the Bible somehow like male dominated, where the woman is a shameful thing who's kind of tucked away in the corner, and the whole narrative's about the patriarchs and the males? Or is there something else going on here?
Actually, when we look at the Bible, the best thing to really do is to start in the beginning with Genesis. And if we start with Genesis, and specifically Genesis chapter 1, then we're really building on the history of the Bible. A lot of people like to start right in the New Testament and get to that stuff that starts to benefit them, or so they believe that's the most beneficial part. So they start right there, and you already have like 80% of the Bible gone. So we like to go back to like Genesis, and in there we see Adam and Eve. God created them, male and female, and in his image and likeness, he created them.
Right. With this, that both of them were created in the image of God, you also come into Genesis chapter 2, where it's talking about the man shall leave his father and mother and become united with his wife. And we think of it as being the other way around. In the Garden of Eden, in those first couple chapters, what we find is that the man and the woman are equal. And what we find is that God has called both of them to the same task. The woman to come alongside as a companion and as a helper with the man. And it's not like she's under him, but both at the same time are both able to talk to God directly. Both of them are able to do the task at hand. And both of them have an equal share in this task.
As a matter of fact, we see even in Genesis 3, when things start to go south, there's still a togetherness with the man and woman.
Yeah.
They haven't separated. There's no hierarchy. There's no dominance between them. There's no suppression of one of the other. Not quite yet, anyways. We see that they both ate the fruit, that they both had their eyes open at the same time, that they both realized that there was a nakedness and shame at the same time, that they both sewed for themselves fig leaves to make a covering at the same time. They both hid at the same time. And when God called them forth, they both came forth to speak with God at the same time. There was still very much a togetherness, even though sin had now officially entered. So the first two places where we begin to see an actual separation is Adam saying to God, that woman that you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate it.
When you continue through the rest of the Bible, the same perspective is being shown, that man and woman are equal with each other. It's the repetition of Adam's "that woman that you gave me" that's so often reflected in the negative stories and in the negative verses. When you even get to the New Testament and you look at Jesus and his example, you look at the writings of Paul and Peter and all these other apostles, they are great heralds of the equality of women. But there are a couple verses that people take completely out of the context of the rest of the whole chapter or even book sometimes. And they say that this one verse is somehow saying something completely contrary to the rest of what the apostles and even Jesus taught.
That same mentality we find comes up in the second place in Genesis, where it really hits on this separation between man and woman. And it's what we consider the curse. In Genesis 3, when God starts going through, okay, each of you were responsible for doing this wicked thing, and so each of you has consequences, and here's what they are. Sometimes the thing that's really overlooked is as soon as this curse shows up in Genesis 3, there's also the promise of redemption. As a matter of fact, the whole New Testament begins to actually have something to stand on at this point, because we get the promise of the Messiah. And this is really the thing that Christianity loves. They really love the Messiah. And this starts here right as the curse comes in. because of sin, because of this wicked thing that happened, you also have the promise of the Messiah. And this is also another problem we tend to have when we're reading the Bible and we're looking at it, and God does record this man and that man and those men. And sometimes there's a little piece about a woman that has like a couple of verses or something. But what we don't understand is in Genesis 3, when we first receive the promise of the Messiah, we hear that it's going to be a he. There's going to be a male child that comes and is going to bring the restoration of all things, that is going to put death aside, that is going to bring the garden back into the fullness that God created for us to live in. And so the promise of the Messiah is also a promise of a male child. So when we're reading through the Bible and we're reading about all these different men and the things that they do right and the things that they do wrong, what we're seeing isn't really like our story as a human race, but we're seeing God's story and God saying, this is how I'm going to work redemption, even though that sin that happened in the beginning continues to creep up and grow and has these spurts where it's huge, but God can bring it a clean slate, and he still has that promise of the Messiah going. He still has that male who's going to come forth and is going to bring the restoration of all things. So if we can read the Bible with the point of view of being interested in God and not just being interested in ourselves, then that whole concept of it being like a male-dominated story really falls into a correct perspective.
And with this, we can also add to the point, it's when that promise is given, it's yes, it's a he that's going to crush the serpent's head, but it's the seed of the woman, and that's an emphasis. And so we can see it's not like the woman is somehow scuffed to the side and kind of put away with, but again, it's a seed of the woman who shall come. And you see this through the whole of the Old Testament, that why was it such an abominable thing when Sarah was barren, when Hannah was barren? Why was this such a shameful thing? It's because they might not be able to participate in this promise of the Mashiach, the one who's going to come, the deliverer who will bring us back into the Garden of Eden. And even after David, and he's considered to be the messianic figure, and it's going to be one of his children who shall be the Messiah, who shall rule forever. Even at that point, there's still the promise of an Elijah who's going to come. And so there's still that hope that you as a woman can birth the Elijah, even if you're not the one who's going to birth the Messiah. And so there's still that hope, and there's still constantly, women are not being downplayed, but again are being brought into the story, so much so that even in the genealogy of Jesus, there are certain women that are pointed out because of their importance in the story.
Now, when we get all the way to Jesus in our history, we find that the Greeks are the one who rule the earth, and they rule with both Greek and Roman influence, and they've also obtained places or influences from all the places that they've conquered, and they're bringing in all sorts of things, and whatever their favorite is what the whole kingdom has to submit to. And they really, in the ancient Greek culture, they really had an oppression of women. It wasn't just a suppression, it was an oppression. Right. And they were very much talk about women as if they were barely better than animals. There are still cultures today that bring out this point of view in a very destructive way. This
Right.
has never benefited human history to treat women in this kind of way. And Jesus was born into this. The one who's going to be the Messiah, who's going to bring the restoration of all things, came in when women had like no value or had very little value because maybe they would produce a male. And it wasn't for the same reason that the Hebrews wanted a male. It wasn't to bring the restoration. There was just a glorification of a physical body and an obsession with physical elements. And they had all these cute little myths that made it all the more better. But the Hebrew and the Hebraic culture and that Greek culture were nothing alike. But it got smeared together as we continued on in history. And so some people have this idea like the way that Greeks thought about women is the way that Jews thought about women because that's
Right.
what Jesus was born into. But that's not true. It's two very separate concepts. And we need to know that because how the Jews would have viewed women does reflect upon God's heart, because they got to carry the name of God and got to be the people of God, and it does reflect upon God's character. And so as Christians today, when we try to find cute and religious ways to have a certain suppression of women or a certain order to where women go versus where men go, then we're reflecting on God's name and on God's character. But it so often we don't make it about that. We make it about ourselves. And we're reading the story wrong. And we're writing our portion of history wrong if that's what we're doing.
So when you come to the letters of the apostles, specifically those things after the book of Acts, by this time the Gentiles have started to come into the what we call the church. They've begun to come into the body of Christ. It's no longer a strictly Jewish thing. And so there's this question that comes in with these who are Hellenized, with these who are underneath the Greek philosophy and this idea that, a good wife is one that's not seen and not heard. How do you teach these people the way that God relates to women? How do you teach these people what God says in regards to wives and to women and to the entire culture that's been built around these considerations? And so you have both Paul and Peter write things in regards to wives and women that we have often taken as our kind of Greek-influenced Gentile ideologies. We've taken these things and said, oh, they're repeating Plato, or oh, they're repeating Aristotle. And we don't realize they might use a similar wording, but they're deliberately not using the same wording because they want to show how what God is saying about this is different than what the philosophers were saying about it.
For those who are able to reconcile the New Testament in different ways, but aren't able to reconcile the Old Testament, the Old Testament is actually one of our favorites because it's such a huge part of the Bible. It's really nothing to be afraid of. And when we look in there, there are things that it says about women. And one of the biggest things that I can really just hit on is it does address different issues of misogyny, of where women are going to be misused and abused. And it seems like the Bible's endorsing that because it speaks of it, and it seems like it's unfair, but it's not endorsing it. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew women from the biblical scriptures had a lot of what we call in America inalienable rights. That means no one could take it away from them, and they couldn't just give it away. They lived in a society that said, these are the rights that our women have, and not just our women, but when our sons marry other women or take other women, these are the rights that they have. And in a lot of other cultures that were around the Hebrew culture and that were around Israel, they didn't give that to their women. Right. Their women were there to be used and abused and thrown away, and it didn't really matter. Or sometimes they were over-glorified. But here in the Hebrews and in Israel, there were inalienable rights, and they had a set understanding of what it was to be a woman.
So one of the things that the critics would bring up would be things like in I believe it's Leviticus, where it talks about a woman who's found who was not a virgin when she got married, and she's allowed to be stoned and put to death by her own parents for this. But this is not like the average thing that the Bible talks about. In fact, it talks instead about other things like when you take a woman and you marry her, if you decide as a man that you don't like her and you want to put her away, then you can do that, but the woman has certain rights that she is allowed to take a certificate of divorce and be called a dignified woman because you as a man decided that you were misogynist and you didn't want to take care of her. There are other things where even foreigners who are not Israel, who are captured by the Israel army, if a man decides that he wants to take this woman, look, this is, at that time, the culture was that this was just an object of war at this point, and that they're allowed to take her as a prostitute, but the Bible says, no, you take her as a wife, and you're not allowed to divorce her. And so this is one of those things where the Bible stands really hardly against a lot of the things that at that time in that culture would have been revolutionary. But we have this problem where we read it 4,000 years after the fact, going back and thinking, oh wow, how primitive of them. You know?
So in the Old Testament, in the first few books, the law, the Torah, we also have like women aren't just property, which would have been very normal for the cultures around them. And unfortunately, sometimes we see in the Middle East that there's still a mindset similar that women are a certain amount of ownership over them or whatever. Um, but it wasn't so with Israel and with God's people. It was like one of the things that they had, well, if a woman's your property, she can be done with whatever, whenever. But God said in his law, he goes out of his way to say, look, if a woman is like on her monthly cycle or she's PMSing, just leave her alone. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say, like, she's unclean, so don't touch her in any way. Leave her alone. Let her have her time. And it goes on in different ways to express it. Like, don't make her feel bad. Just leave her alone. If she's sitting there, let her sit there. Don't take her seat from her. And there's different ways that God expresses just let this woman and her body have that time to go through this process that I've allowed to happen. You also have during the time of pregnancy, in which she gives birth, that there's a certain time of uncleanness. And again, this is like a leave her alone time and let her bond with that child. And we see with the female child that it's actually a longer amount of time than with the male child. And people have said, does this mean that the females are more unclean? But even in our modern science, we have this thing where we look at mothers and the bonding that happens with the new infant baby, and that there is a different bonding that happens with a female baby and then a male baby, and the way that they relate. And so it's like God, before we had modern science, said, just let those two women or girls have time together to form a bond. And this bond will help that baby girl throughout her whole life continue to be able to bond with others. It's very interesting indeed.
One last thing we're going to visit with the Old Testament is the patriarchs, and specifically the way that the patriarchs loved their wives. You have in the example of Abraham, the father of the faith. Like if we could choose anybody to express what it means to have faith and what it means to be a part of God's people, Abraham is one of the people that we would go towards. And Abraham so loved Sarah that not only does he like take her advice, but he actually would then go so far as when she's having trouble with her midwife Hagar, Abraham actually tells her, look, whatever's in your heart, do that. Because he so trusts her that he doesn't have to come down with thunder and say, why are you women doing this? He's able to actually trust his wife enough to say, I have full confidence that you are going to do the right thing. And he just leaves it at that. You get to the next man, Isaac, their son. And Isaac so loves Rebekah that he gets caught fondling her when he's in Egypt because he had told them, this is not my wife, it's my sister. And even if it's true, he's caught playing with his wife, and they notice there's no way this is his sister. You get to the next man, to their son Jacob. Jacob so loves Rachel. He works not just 7 years for her, but has to work 14 years to get to her. And then he works another 6 years under Laban so that he can have a livelihood, so that they can leave and set up their own family. This is a man who devotes 20 years of his life to building up this one woman in the family that he wants to have with her. And when she dies in Benjamin's birth, she wants to name him son of my sorrow. But he says, no, not son of my sorrow. Benjamin, son of my joy. And it's not that it's a joy that his wife passed. It's a joy that this is the son of the one whom he's loved. And he cherished Joseph, the other son of Rachel, above all the other 11. And then when Joseph is missing, he cherishes Benjamin in the same kind of light, if not even more. And so you have these men who are our patriarchs, who are those founders of the faith for us. These are the ones in whom Israel comes from. This example is something completely contrary to what the atheists, those who are in the pulpit, Islam, all those who come against Christianity and against the Bible, this is what they are trying to tell us that Christianity promotes. And yet the Bible itself, our patriarchs itself, give an entirely contrary example.
One of the things that we go through with the Bible is it does have a lot of written specific things that we can go to and we can find out what does God say. But sometimes we get these people who take these words and they take them out of context, or they teach us that they mean something different than what's in the Bible. So we're looking not only for the words of what does the Bible say, but we're looking for the examples. Same as we do with the life of Jesus. It's not just Jesus' words, but it's the example that he lived. So when we see these examples of the patriarchs and of Jesus, and the example of how they treated women with honor, even Paul, who gets a lot of discredit, treats women with honor. And he even he works with women and treats them with honor. When we see these examples, we can't just take the words and say, well, it says this. We have to look at those words and say, what does it mean, though? We have to be able to trust the character, the integrity of those who bring forth these words. Otherwise, they can always get twisted. Whether these words are promoted as good for women or they're promoted as derogatory towards women, this is something we all face in our modern day. As humans, we face being built up and being torn down. This is an issue that we're going to continue to look at, and we're going to continue to look at the myths that are involved with women, Christianity, church, and God, and which ones have bases and which ones are just completely overstated. Because when we look at this, this is a very serious topic. Does God hate women? The question shouldn't exist, but it does exist, and it has reason to exist. And that's just one thing we really want to debunk. So if you're willing to join us for another messy, unclean journey, hold on, because this one is going to be a doozy.